The broadcast went live at 8:37 on a Thursday evening. President Stephen Calhoun stood at a podium, draped in flags, his hands gripping both sides, as though the wood itself required conquest. Behind him, armed personnel in tactical gear formed a wall of silent authority. The speech had been prepared for 3 days, every word vetted, every pause calculated. "My fellow Americans," Calhoun began, his voice carrying the practiced weight of manufactured gravitas. "Tonight I address you not as a candidate, but as your commander in the fight for our nation's survival." The camera pulled back slightly. Homelander stepped into frame from stage left, uninvited but inevitable. His cape settled behind him like a corporate flag. The smile he wore belonged on billboards, not battlefields. Calhoun's jaw tightened for half a second before the political mask reasserted itself. "Recent events have proven beyond doubt that our institutions face threats from within," Calhoun continued, though his eyes flickered toward the intruder beside him. "Effective immediately, I am declaring a state of national emergency. Martial law will be enforced in conjunction with enhanced security protocols. Supes who have demonstrated loyalty to American values will be deputized with full law enforcement authority." Homelander leaned toward the microphone. Calhoun did not move aside. The moment stretched taut as a tripwire until the older man yielded precisely 3 inches of space. "What the president means," Homelander said, his voice warm as poisoned honey, "is that the age of hiding behind masks and bureaucracy is over. Starlight, Butcher, everyone who thought they could tear down what makes America strong. We see you, and we're coming." The feed cut to commercial 40 seconds early. By 9:15:17, states had activated National Guard units. By 9:43, the first reports of deputized supes conducting raids appeared on social media before being systematically scrubbed. The machinery of enforcement had been waiting for permission. Now, it had a signature. What happened next was not an explosion, it was a rewriting. Every screen in America blinked once. Not a power failure, not a technical glitch, a single synchronized blink, as though reality itself had stuttered. When the feeds returned, the color balance had shifted imperceptibly colder. The audio carried a faint harmonic underneath the standard broadcast hum, something that sat wrong in the ear without announcing itself. Calhoun was still speaking. Homelander was still smiling. But the control room coordinating the national feed had gone silent. Technicians stared at equipment that reported normal function while displaying absolute abnormality. Every channel showed the same image, not a hijacking, a replacement. As if the original broadcast had simply been overwritten at the source code level. The man in dark metal appeared in the background first, standing at the edge of the secured platform where no security personnel had been stationed. Cameras should not have caught the angle. The depth of field was wrong. But there he stood, rendered in perfect clarity, while everything around him blurred at the edges. He wore leather that drank light, studded with metal that seemed to have been forged in absent furnaces. The visor across his eyes was not black, but a color that predated naming something dark beyond the spectrum's acknowledgement. Chains hung from his belt, their ends weighted with dark clasps. On his chest, the bat symbol had been inverted and sharpened. Its wings spread like a manifesto written in scar tissue. When his mouth curved, the camera caught it, even though he stood 50 yards from the nearest lens. The expression belonged to neither joy nor malice, nor any human gradient between. It was the grin of equations that consumed their own variables. The facial configuration of systems realizing they were always jokes. Homelander's expression changed first. The manufactured warmth drained from his face, replaced by something older and more honest. Recognition of a predator that should not exist in his territory. His eyes tracked to the intruder on the platform. For 3 seconds, America watched its apex defender go still, with the paralysis of prey. The visitor raised one hand. Not a wave, not a gesture, just an acknowledgement of presence. Every screen in the nation flickered again, and when they stabilized, a message scrolled across the bottom in white text against black. Order is the easiest thing to break. The text remained for 7 seconds. Then it vanished, and with it every protocol that governed emergency broadcasts. News anchors found themselves reading scripts they did not remember receiving. Social media platforms auto-deleted posts containing certain keywords, then forgot they had done so. In server farms across Virginia and California, algorithms rewrote their own priorities according to logic no programmer had coded. Calhoun tried to continue his speech. His mouth moved. The teleprompter scrolled, but the audio that broadcast was not his voice. It was static, arranged into syllables, fragments of his own words played backward and then forward again in sequences that formed new meanings. Promises of order became threats. Calls for unity fractured into accusations. The speech ate itself and multiplied. Homelander stepped forward, fists clenched. His eyes began to glow that familiar red, the precursor to violence that had ended so many threats before. He scanned the platform. The man in dark metal was gone. He scanned the crowd, the streets, the sky. Nothing. His thermal vision showed nothing. His X-ray vision penetrated concrete and steel, but found no anomaly. Yet every camera in America still broadcast the image of a man in dark metal, standing exactly where he had been smiling at the apex predator who could no longer find him. In Vought Tower, 14 floors above Manhattan, Sister Sage stood before a wall of monitors in a conference room that cost more than most schools. She was the smartest person in any room, and had built her career on that absolute certainty. Her mind processed the broadcast in parallel streams, analyzing audio distortion, visual artifacts, data packet structures, security breaches. Every vector of attack simultaneously. The analysis returned 0 results. Not because the attack was sophisticated, because it was not an attack. The broadcast had not been intercepted. It had been replaced at a level that predated transmission. Someone had rewritten the conditions under which broadcasting existed. Ashley Barrett stood 3 feet behind her phone, vibrating with 18 concurrent emergency calls that she had stopped answering. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear of the unknown figure, from fear of the known response Vought would demand. She had survived corporate purges, PR nightmares, and Homelander's tantrums by being useful. This was the first time she could not determine what usefulness looked like. "Tell me you have something," Ashley said. Her voice carried the brittle edge of someone maintaining composure through scheduled breathing exercises. Sage did not turn around. "I have confirmation that this should be impossible. That's not a plan. It's an acknowledgement that our framework for understanding threats is no longer relevant." Sage tapped one screen showing traffic camera footage from 6 blocks away. The same figure standing on a rooftop that surveillance had never monitored, watching the chaos bloom. Whoever this is, they're not operating inside our system. They're operating outside it. Outside what framework? All of them. The phone in Ashley's pocket buzzed with a new message. Not from her contacts. From an unknown number that bypassed every security filter Vought employed. She pulled it out, hands steadying through sheer professional reflex. The message contained no words, just a single image. A photograph of Vought Tower's executive conference room taken from the exact position where Ashley currently stood, time-stamped 4 minutes into the future. She dropped the phone. It did not fall. It hovered at waist height for 2 seconds before settling gently on the conference table screen, still illuminated, showing an image of something that had not happened yet, but would. Sage finally turned. "What was that?" Ashley could not speak. She pointed at the phone. Sage picked it up, read the metadata, ran 6 layers of verification. Every test confirmed the timestamp, 4 minutes from now. She set the device down carefully, the kind of care reserved for unexploded ordnance. "We need to evacuate this room," Sage said quietly. "Why, what's going to happen in 4 minutes? I don't know. But whoever sent this wants us to know they've already decided what happens next. Our job is to react. They did not evacuate." Sage's intellect had limits, but her pride did not. If someone wanted to prove they could predict her movements, she would prove she could deviate. She sat down at the conference table and opened her laptop, initiating deep analysis protocols that would trace the message origin through every digital pathway available. 4 minutes passed. Nothing happened. Ashley's heart rate had climbed to 130. Sage's expression held the particular satisfaction of someone who had correctly called a bluff. The laptop display went black. Not a shutdown, an absence. The image that replaced it was not shown on the surface, but rather existed in the space where the display had been a 3-dimensional rendering of laughing eyes behind a visor that should not have been able to transmit dimensional data through a 2-dimensional medium. The eyes looked directly at Sage. Then they shifted to Ashley. Then they closed. When they opened again, they were in the room. Not on the screen, not as a projection, present. The figure stood at the far end of the conference table, having crossed the distance between impossibility and manifestation without the courtesy of transition. He had not teleported. He had simply stopped being absent. Sage's hand went to her sidearm. Ashley's went to her phone. Neither completed the motion. Not because the figure stopped them, because they both understood with the certainty of prey, recognizing a predator's gaze that the actions were already accounted for, and therefore irrelevant. "You're very intelligent," the figure said to Sage. His voice was not distorted. It was simply wrong, as if human speech had been studied by something that understood language but not lungs. "You see patterns, predict outcomes. It's made you valuable." He tilted his head. The visor caught light from sources that did not exist in the room. "I'm here to show you that intelligence is just another framework. And frameworks are tools, and tools belong to whoever holds them tightest." Sage found her voice. Training reasserted itself. "What do you want?" The man's expression widened. It was not a human reaction mapped onto human features. It was the concept of amusement given teeth. "I want you to keep doing exactly what you're doing. Think, analyze, plan. Because every solution you generate will feed the system I'm building. You'll be very useful." He turned to Ashley. "You've spent your entire career surviving by being necessary. Tonight you'll learn the difference between necessary and permitted." Before either woman could respond, he was gone, not vanished. Simply no longer there, as though the presence had been conditional on being observed and the condition had expired. The laptop screen returned to normal. Ashley's phone showed no record of the message. The conference room's security footage would later reveal no evidence of entry or exit, but both women remained absolutely still for 17 seconds, breathing in the space where something had just redefined the rules of their existence. Outside across America, the emergency broadcast continued. Calhoun's voice emerged from the static, reassembled into coherence, delivering a speech that was 87% his original words, arranged in an order that transformed promise into prophecy. He spoke of security, order, the necessity of decisive action against internal threats, and beneath it all, layered so subtly that no audio analysis would detect it for 3 more days, ran a frequency just below conscious hearing, a pressure that made panic feel reasonable, a vibration in the teeth that transformed fear into permission, permission into demand, demand into law. By midnight, 6 states reported isolated violence against suspected Starlight sympathizers. By 2 in the morning, The first deputized soup executed enforcement action, resulting in 3 civilian casualties, officially classified as justified force. By dawn, the term preventive purge appeared on cable news without anyone questioning who had introduced the phrase. America had not fallen. It had been quietly repurchased under new management. The sale had gone unnoticed because the buyer had rewritten the contract while the ink was still wet on the original. And somewhere in spaces between broadcast signals and server farms, between satellite feeds and cell tower transmissions, the man in dark metal stood at the center of every feed, and none of them watching a nation learn to laugh at its own jokes. The age of law had become the age of laughter. The difference was simply a matter of who held the pen when the rules were written. Homelander stood on Vought Tower's roof, fists, clenched eyes scanning a city that offered no targets. For the first time in his existence, he was hunting a prey that refused to be found. Not because it was hiding, because it had already won the encounter before he knew the fight had started. 30 stories below, in server rooms and conference halls and panic rooms and executive suites. People who believed they controlled the narrative learned they had only ever been granted permission to speak. The real control had always lived elsewhere, waiting for precisely the right moment to introduce itself. And in that introduction, it had not announced its name. It had simply offered its terms and waited for the world to realize what it had already become. The broadcast finally ended at 12:53 in the morning. By then, it no longer mattered what Calhoun said or Homelander promised. The message had been delivered not through words, but through the fundamental restructuring of how messages could be received. Tomorrow, the news would call it a terrorist attack, a hacking incident, a technical malfunction. They would be wrong on all counts, but correct in their conclusion, something had changed. The machinery of power had been compromised at a level that made resistance and compliance equally futile, because the man in the visor had not come to conquer. He had come to edit. And in a world built on narratives, the editor always had final say. The screens went dark. America slept uneasily, dreaming of flags and laws, and voices that spoke in frequencies just below conscious detection. And somewhere in that darkness, a laugh echoed through channels. No broadcaster-controlled celebrating the oldest truth of civilization order was only ever a temporary agreement between entropy and those who thought they could outrun it. The agreement had just been revised. Welcome to the new terms. That opening scene gave me serious chills. Homelander is usually the scariest guy in the room, but he looked totally lost when that mysterious figure showed up. It is wild that the intruder did not even throw a punch, but just rewrote the broadcast like he was editing a video game. I really want to see how Vought handles being turned into a massive national joke in the next part. What do you guys think about this mystery guy? Is he actually magic or just super tech savvy? Let me know your theories in the comments. The emergency meeting convened at 3:47 in the morning. No one called it a crisis. The word that appeared in every memo, every secure message, every hurried conversation was incident. As though labeling it correctly would contain what had already spread beyond containment. Vought Tower's executive suite had transformed into a command center. Monitors displayed news feeds from 18 networks, all cycling through the same footage with different commentary. Social media analytics scrolled past too quickly for human reading processed, instead by algorithms that flagged keywords, sentiment shifts, engagement spikes. The raw numbers told a story no one wanted to narrate. America was afraid, and fear was profitable only when Vought controlled the narrative. Sister Sage stood at the head of the conference table, tablet in hand, exhaustion held at bay by the particular cocktail of prescription stimulants that kept brilliant minds functional past their biological limits. Around her sat the operational architects of Vought's public image, PR directors, legal counsel, the vice president of crisis management, whose job description had been written for scandals involving drugs and sex tapes. Not reality itself malfunctioning on national television. Current assessment. Sage said. Her tone carried no emotion. Facts were facts regardless of how they felt. We're dealing with a sophisticated cyber intrusion coupled with psychological warfare tactics. Broadcast hijacking, deepfake technology, possibly state-sponsored, though attribution remains unclear. Ashley sat 3 chairs down, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she had not sipped from in 20 minutes. She watched Sage deliver the briefing with the detached precision of someone describing weather patterns, as though this were solvable, as though frameworks and models and strategic responses meant anything after what they had witnessed. Attribution is irrelevant, one of the legal team said. His name was Marcus something. Ashley had stopped learning names 2 years ago when the turnover rate made friendship a liability. We need a response that satisfies federal authorities and keeps Homelander from doing something that generates more headlines. Homelander is not the problem, Sage replied. Homelander is a solution waiting for a target. Once we identify the threat vector, he becomes our most effective deterrent. Ashley's phone buzzed. She glanced down. A text from an unknown sender. No words, just coordinates. She deleted it without thinking the reflexive action of someone trained to ignore anything that complicated her already impossible day. 3 seconds later, her screen refreshed. The coordinates reappeared this time with a timestamp. 12 hours from now. A location she recognized, the federal courthouse downtown. She set the device face down and tried to focus on Sage's presentation. Our primary objective is narrative control, Sage continued. The public saw something unprecedented. We need to give them a name for it that makes sense within their existing worldview. Terrorism, hacking, foreign interference. Anything that fits the pattern of threats they already understand. And if it doesn't fit? Marcus asked. Sage looked at him with the patience of a professor addressing a particularly slow undergraduate. Then we make it fit. Reality is negotiable when you control how people receive information about reality. The irony was not lost on Ashley. 12 hours ago, someone had proven exactly that point by rewriting the conditions under which broadcast media existed. And now, Vaught's smartest mind was proposing to fight back, using the same playbook, unaware that the playbook itself had been edited while they slept. Homelander arrived without knocking. The door simply opened, and he filled the space where the door had been, cape settling around him like territorial markings. His expression carried the particular fury of a god who had just discovered the limits of omnipotence. "Tell me you found him," Homelander said, not a question. A command phrased as a courtesy. "We're establishing parameters," Sage began. "Fuck parameters." Homelander moved to the center of the room. Everyone leaned back instinctively, creating space, not out of respect, but survival reflex. "I want a name. I want a location. I want something I can put through a wall. We don't have a physical target yet." "Then make one up." Homelander's voice dropped to the register that preceded violence. "I'm not standing here explaining to the world that some hacker made me look weak. Give me a story I can sell, or I'll write my own." Ashley recognized the tone. She had heard it before, every PR disaster, every cover-up, every creative reinterpretation of events that turned body counts into acceptable losses. Homelander did not care about truth. He cared about narrative dominance. And right now, for the first time she could remember, he had none. Sage maintained her composure with visible effort. "What you're describing is exactly what our adversary wants. Reactive violence that generates more chaos they can exploit. We need to identify the strategic objective before we engage. The strategic objective is me not looking like a bitch on every screen in America. Then perhaps," Sage said carefully, "we should focus on demonstrating strength through measured action rather than..." The wall behind her developed a smoking hole. Not large, perhaps 3 inches in diameter. Homelander had not moved. His eyes still glowed faintly red, the residual heat vision of a warning shot delivered to architecture instead of flesh. Measured, Homelander repeated. That's what got us here. Measured responses to Starlight. Measured containment of the boys. Look where measured got us. He turned to face the assembled executives. New plan. We stop reacting and start purging. Anyone connected to Starlight's little revolution. Anyone who leaked. Anyone who knows too much or asks too many questions. We clean house until the only people left are people who understand what happens when you challenge me. The room absorbed this in silence. Not shocked silence. The silence of people doing mental calculations about survival odds and severance packages. That would constitute a significant escalation, Marcus managed. Call it whatever corporate word makes you feel better. I call it clarity. Homelander moved toward the door, then paused. And someone figure out what happened last night. I don't care if you have to invent the explanation. Make it believable, make it airtight, and make it something I can use to justify everything I'm about to do. He left. The door closed behind him with the finality of a casket lid. For 10 seconds, no one spoke. Then Marcus cleared his throat. Well, that was suboptimal. That was predictable, Sage corrected. She set down her tablet and rubbed her temples. He's operating on ego defense, not strategy. Which means our job is to build a framework that channels his impulses into something we can control. Can we, Ashley heard herself ask, control him? Sage looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been exhaustion masquerading as empathy. We never controlled him. We just made him believe his goals aligned with ours. That's what management is. Ashley thought about the coordinates on her phone. 12 hours. Federal courthouse. She wondered what happened when management principles met something that rewrote the rules of management itself. I need a list, Sage said, already typing on her tablet. Everyone in the organization with access to confidential data. Everyone who might have leaked. Everyone whose loyalty is questionable. Cross-reference with known Starlight sympathizers and anyone who contacted media outlets in the past 6 months. You're serious, Marcus said. Homelander is serious. Whether I agree is irrelevant. He's going to purge regardless. Our job is to aim the purge so it solves problems instead of creating them. Ashley's hands tightened around the coffee mug. You're asking me to make a kill list. I'm asking you to make a personnel optimization report. What happens after that is not your responsibility. It was such perfect corporate doublespeak that Ashley almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she nodded and pulled out her tablet, already knowing which names would populate the top of the list. People she had worked with. People she had eaten lunch with. People whose children's names she knew because you learned that information when you wanted to seem human. The first name she typed was Linda Chen, VP of Media Relations. Brilliant, ambitious, and someone who had once questioned a Homelander press release in a meeting with actual journalists present. The second was David Park, senior analyst, who had been overheard making jokes about Vought's stock price correlation with civilian casualties. By the seventh name, Ashley's fingers moved automatically, muscle memory overriding conscience. This was survival. This was what being useful looked like when usefulness meant deciding who lived long enough to regret their honesty. Send that to me when you're done, Sage said. I'll coordinate with legal on the framing. If we're going to do this, we do it with documentation. Paper trails that show due diligence. Performance reviews that retroactively justify termination. You mean execution? Sage did not flinch. I mean termination. What Homelander does with terminated personnel is outside my jurisdiction. The lie was so smooth that Ashley wondered if Sage actually believed it. Whether intelligence that vast could really create a buffer between cause and effect, or if this was just another coping mechanism for people who had decided that being useful was worth more than being good. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations. Legal huddles, PR contingencies. Someone mentioned federal coordination, and someone else mentioned plausible deniability, and the words blurred together into the background static of institutional violence. Ashley left without being dismissed. No one noticed. She took the elevator down to the 42nd floor where her actual office existed as a fiction of workspace she had not occupied in 3 weeks. Her desk held framed photos of a family she had abandoned for career opportunities that now felt like prison sentences. She sat down, opened her laptop. The document was still there waiting, Personnel Optimization Report, confidential. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at it with the dread of someone who knew bad news traveled faster than good. The same coordinates, the same timestamp. But now there was text below. This is where someone dies because of your report. You'll watch it happen. Then you'll understand what permission means. Ashley stared at the message until the words stopped being language and became abstract shapes. Then she deleted it. Then she opened her email and sent the report to Sister Sage CC'd to legal, B CC'd to her personal account as insurance that would never actually protect her from anything. The machinery was in motion now. Personnel would receive notifications. Security would escort people to exits. And somewhere in that process, Homelander would make an example of someone, and the example would become policy, and policy would become normal. This was how it happened. Not with monsters announcing themselves. With professionals doing their jobs efficiently, and people like Ashley making lists, because making lists was what kept you off other people's lists. She closed the laptop, looked out the window at Manhattan stretching away in all directions. Somewhere down there, people were waking up to a country they thought they understood. By noon, the narrative would stabilize. By evening, the explanation would feel true simply from repetition. By tomorrow, last night would be remembered as the night terrorism tried to break America and Homelander stood strong. The story would be wrong. But stories did not have to be true. They just had to be consistent. Ashley wondered what happened to people who realized the difference but kept working anyway, whether that made them complicit or just realistic. Whether the distinction mattered when the consequences looked the same either way. Her phone buzzed once more. No message this time, just a notification that her calendar had been updated. An event added for noon today. Location Federal Courthouse. Description mandatory attendance. She did not remember adding it. The calendar system required authentication. But there it was, scheduled with the authority of something that had already decided she would be present. Ashley closed her eyes and tried to remember what hoping felt like. The memory was distant. Professional survival had long ago overwritten softer emotions with pragmatic calculations. Hope was expensive. Usefulness was cheaper. She would go to the courthouse. She would watch whatever happened there. And then she would continue doing her job, because not doing her job meant becoming one of the names on someone else's list. The morning light began filtering through the office windows. Somewhere in the building, Homelander was planning his demonstration of strength. Somewhere in legal contracts were being written that would retroactively justify violence. Somewhere in PR press releases were being drafted that would transform massacre into defensive necessity. And somewhere beyond the walls of Vought Tower, in spaces that did not appear on organizational charts or security footage, something watched the machinery engage exactly as predicted. Not interfering, not adjusting. Just observing the beautiful efficiency of systems that had learned to destroy themselves with proper authorization. The day had officially begun. By its end, fewer people would be alive to see tomorrow. The difference would be documented, justified, and filed away as evidence of organizational health. Welcome to the future. It looked exactly like the past, only faster. The courthouse operation began at 11:32. Official designation, high priority threat, neutralization. Legal basis, Emergency Powers Act Section 7. as amended during overnight legislative session that most congressional staffers would not learn about until their morning briefings. Authorization chained Department of Homeland Security to federal marshals to deputize soups, each layer of approval documented with timestamps that would survive any future inquiry. Target Marcus Webb, 43, former Vought data analyst turned whistleblower. Known associates, 3 Starlight Movement organizers, 2 investigative journalists, 1 civil liberties attorney. Threat level red based on assessment criteria that had been quietly updated to include possession of classified corporate information as grounds for immediate detention. The arrest warrant was clean. The evidence was circumstantial but sufficient. The legal framing was airtight. Webb would be dead by noon. Ashley stood across the street from the federal courthouse, phone in hand, pretending to check messages while watching the perimeter. She had arrived 20 minutes early, compelled by calendar notification she had not created and could not delete. Around her, morning traffic flowed normally. Pedestrians bought coffee from street vendors. The city performed its daily rituals without acknowledging that today marked the first time America would kill one of its own citizens under laws written between midnight and dawn. 3 blocks away, Sister Sage monitored the operation from a mobile command unit disguised as a news van. Monitors showed body cam feeds from 6 different angles. Audio channels carried chatter between federal coordinators and soup assets. Everything recorded. Everything legal, everything proceeding exactly as planned, which was precisely what troubled her. She had reviewed the operational timeline 4 times. The gaps were microseconds, imperceptible to anyone not looking for them. But Sage had built her reputation on finding patterns in noise, and the noise here was too clean. Orders issued before requests were filed, approvals granted before proposals were submitted, as though someone had edited the timeline, retroactively inserting authorization where procedural delay should have existed. She flagged it, filed a note, returned her attention to the live feeds. On the courthouse steps, Deputy Marshal Chen received confirmation over encrypted radio. Target located. 3rd floor judge's chambers exactly as intel predicted. No weapons detected. Cooperation expected, but not assumed. Rules of engagement, verbal commands, physical restraint if necessary, lethal force authorized if target demonstrates enhanced abilities or attempts escape. Webb did not have powers. His file confirmed it. But the rules treated everyone as potentially superhuman now, which meant the threshold for lethal response had been lowered to the point of inevitability. 3 soups approached the building. Not celebrities, not household names. Mid-tier assets whose faces appeared on Vought promotional materials, but never magazine covers. Swift, codenamed Velocity, possessed enhanced speed, but nothing approaching A-Train's velocity. The other 2 were Strong Arm and Barrier names that described their abilities with corporate efficiency. They moved with the careful precision of people following orders they did not fully endorse, but could not afford to question. Homelander had made his position clear. Sage had made the consequences of failure even clearer. And somewhere in the gap between those 2 certainties, professional survival meant doing what you were told, regardless of how it felt. Webb emerged from chambers flanked by his attorney, a woman named Catherine Price, who specialized in whistleblower protection and had filed 17 motions to dismiss over the past week, all denied, most without explanation. She saw the soups and stopped. "My client is cooperating voluntarily," Price said, her voice carrying the careful projection of someone who knew body cams were recording. "There's no need for this level of force." Marshal Chen stepped forward. "We have a warrant for Marcus Webb's arrest on charges of theft of classified information, conspiracy to disseminate state secrets, and terrorism-related activities." "Terrorism?" Price's composure cracked slightly. "He gave documents to journalists. That's protected speech. Not under current emergency provisions." Chen gestured to the soups. "Mr. Webb, you need to come with us." Webb raised his hands slowly. No sudden movements. The posture of someone who had watched enough footage to know how this ended for people who made the wrong gesture at the wrong moment. I'm not resisting. You don't need them. But they did. That was the point. Not the arrest, the demonstration, the establishment of precedent. When historians looked back, they would see clean footage of a lawful arrest conducted with overwhelming force because the law now required it. They would not see the editing that made overwhelming force seem reasonable. Swift moved first, crossing the distance between entry and target in a blur that body cams struggled to capture. Webb flinched. That was all. A reflexive movement. Human instinct when confronted with superhuman velocity. The flinch was interpreted as resistance. Strong arm grabbed Webb's arm with force sufficient to crack bone. The sound was distinct even over the ambient courthouse noise. Webb screamed. Price stepped forward shouting objections that would be documented and ignored. Barrier erected a translucent wall between attorney and client, cutting off physical access while maintaining clear sightlines for cameras. Suspect is resisting, Swift reported into his comm. The lie was delivered with the flatness of someone reading from a script they had not written but could not deviate from. Webb was on the ground, now face pressed against marble flooring that had witnessed 1,000 mundane proceedings and would now serve as the stage for something unprecedented. His arm hung at an angle that biology did not permit. He was crying, not shouting, not fighting, crying the way people cry when they realize hope has administrative limitations. Marshal Chen approached with restraints. Standard procedure. Webb would be secured, transported, processed through systems designed for this exact function. He would have access to counsel. Due process would be observed. Every box checked, every requirement met. And then he would disappear into a detention framework so new that oversight had not yet been established. Ashley watched from across the street as federal vehicles surrounded the courthouse. She had the angle that cameras did not capture. The gap between official narrative and actual event. From here she could see Price being escorted away by marshals. Could see Webb being carried on a stretcher to an ambulance that did not have civilian markings. Could see Strong Arm and Barrier exchanging glances that suggested even they understood they had just participated in something that would not age well in history books. Her phone buzzed. No message, just a photo. The same scene she was witnessing, but captured from an angle that should not exist. Looking down from above, from a vantage point that would require a helicopter or drone, neither of which appeared in the airspace overhead. The timestamp on the photo predated the arrest by 40 seconds. She deleted it. The deletion did not take. The image remained burned into her screen like a ghost that refused to acknowledge its own erasure. 3 blocks away, Sage replayed the body cam recordings frame by frame. The break point came at the moment of first contact. Swift's approach, Webb's flinch. The gap between stimulus and response was wrong. Not by much. 0.3 seconds. But 0.3 seconds during which Webb should have been processing visual input and generating motor response, and instead, he simply reacted as though the reaction had been pre-loaded. She ran biometric analysis, pupil dilation patterns, facial muscle activation sequences. Everything matched normal human fear response. But the timing suggested fear that arrived slightly ahead of its trigger. Impossible without precognition, or possible with precise manipulation of sensory input. Sage flagged the footage for deeper analysis and immediately received a notification that the footage had been classified as evidence in an ongoing federal investigation access restricted to personnel. With clearance she technically possessed, but would take 6 hours to activate. By which time the window for questioning the arrest would have closed and the narrative would have solidified. She sat back, looked at the monitor array. Within this data was proof of intervention, not dramatic, not supernatural. Just the quiet presence of someone editing reality at the administrative level. But proving it would require showing her work. And showing her work would generate a paper trail. And paper trails fed the apparatus. And the apparatus could be turned against its creators. Sage closed the analysis software, filed the incident as resolved, made a note in her personal encrypted drive that she would never access again, because accessing it would create metadata that could be tracked. The operation concluded at 12:03. Total time 31 minutes. Injuries sustained: 1 compound fracture subject's arm. Legal complications: none. Public response pending, but early social media sentiment analysis suggested the narrative was holding. Terrorism, classified data, national security, words that carried enough weight to justify almost anything if repeated with sufficient authority. By 12:30, news networks carried the official statement. Federal authorities had apprehended a domestic terrorism suspect with ties to Starlight's extremist faction. Subject sustained injuries during lawful arrest due to non-compliance. Investigation ongoing. No further questions. The footage would loop on cable news for 18 hours. Each repetition would make the arrest feel more justified, more normal. More like something that had always been possible and only now was being properly enforced. Homelander watched the coverage from Vought Tower, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He had not given the order, had not been consulted on timing or target selection, had simply been informed after the fact that his image had been used in the legal briefing, his words about cleaning house cited as strategic doctrine. He was no longer the apex predator. He was the mascot. And mascots did not get to choose when and how they were deployed. Well, Sage entered the executive suite without knocking. You wanted action. There's your action. I wanted to pick the target. You wanted a demonstration that we're in control. This demonstrates exactly that. Homelander turned from the window. I look weak. Someone else made the arrest. Someone else took the credit. I'm just the fucking poster they hang on the wall to make it look legitimate. You're the reason it is legitimate. Your authority, your mandate. Without you, this is just federal overreach. With you, it's policy. The logic was sound. The logic was infuriating. Because logic meant accepting that power could be delegated, diffused, distributed across systems that no longer required his presence to function. He had wanted this. The machinery of enforcement operating on his behalf. But he had imagined himself at the controls, not realizing that once the machinery was built, it would keep running regardless of who fed it fuel. Who picked the target? Homelander asked quietly. Algorithmic assessment based on threat matrices. Nobody picked anyone. The infrastructure identified the highest priority case, and we executed. Bullshit. Infrastructure doesn't have initiative. Someone pointed the algorithm. Someone decided what criteria mattered. Sage met his eyes. If that's true, then you should be asking who benefits from you not being involved in target selection. The question hung between them like smoke from a fire neither could locate. Ashley returned to Vought Tower at 1:15, passing through security, with credentials that granted access to floors she no longer visited. Her desk had accumulated new files during her absence. Personnel matters, budget reviews, a memo about updated protocols for managing press inquiries regarding enforcement actions. She opened the memo, read 3 sentences, closed it. In the legal department, 3 floors above, someone was writing the rules for how America would describe its descent into authorized violence. Contract specialists were crafting language that would make everything permissible if phrased correctly. In PR teams were designing talking points that would turn objections into extremism. And beyond these walls, beyond the structures and carefully maintained illusions of order, something watched the machinery refine itself. Not interfering, not needing to. Just providing the occasional edit, the strategic comma, the reordered clause, the subtle adjustment that transformed hesitation into commitment. The day progressed. Webb was transferred to a federal holding facility whose location would not appear in public records. Price filed emergency motions that would be denied by judges appointed during the same overnight session that had authorized the arrest. News cycles moved on to the next story, which happened to involve another suspect, another arrest, another demonstration that the new normal was merely normal. By evening, 6 additional operations had been conducted. None as public as Webb, none as clean, but all following the same template. Identify, authorize, execute, document. The machinery was learning. Efficiency improved with each iteration. Resistance declined as people recognized patterns and adjusted behavior accordingly. Fear was expensive. Compliance was free. Firecracker appeared on the evening news broadcast at 6:47, invited as an expert on domestic extremism. She spoke with the conviction of someone whose entire identity depended on being correct, regardless of facts. Starlight's movement was terrorism. Webb was proof. The arrests were necessary. Anyone who disagreed was either naive or complicit. The appearance had been arranged by PR. The talking points had been provided by legal. The specific phrasing had been approved by Sage. But somewhere in the editing process between draft and broadcast, certain words had been adjusted. Emphasis added. Implications sharpened. Firecracker did not notice. She read from the teleprompter with the confidence of someone who believed she was speaking her own thoughts. By 7:30, social media engagement had tripled. By 8, death threats against Starlight sympathizers had reached levels that required algorithmic suppression. By 9, 3 separate vigilante incidents had been reported to local police, who referred them to federal authorities, who classified them as part of ongoing investigations. The evening ended quietly. No explosions, no revelations, no dramatic confrontations between good and evil. Just a country learning that authority once granted did not require justification to expand. Just people making small compromises that accumulated into large surrenders. Just protocols optimizing themselves toward outcomes that had been decided by whoever wrote the initial conditions. In a federal facility whose location would not appear in public records, Marcus Webb sat in a cell that existed outside judicial oversight, wondering if his attorney would find him before the paperwork reclassified him as something that did not require habeas corpus. In her apartment overlooking the East River, Ashley lay awake calculating how many names she would need to add to tomorrow's list to remain useful enough to avoid becoming a name herself. At Vaught Tower, Homelander stared at his reflection in floor-to-ceiling windows and tried to remember when he had stopped being necessary and started being decorative. And somewhere beyond. Measurement, beyond location, beyond the systems that thought they were writing their own rules. Something observed the beautiful efficiency of dominoes falling exactly as arranged. Not pushing, not forcing, just removing friction. The machinery would handle the rest. Tomorrow would bring more arrests, more demonstrations, more opportunities for people to choose between complicity and consequences. Each choice would generate data. Each data point would refine the algorithm. Each refinement would make the next choice easier. This was not conquest. This was cultivation. The careful gardening of a society that had been given every tool it needed to build its own prison and had accepted them gratefully because they were presented as keys. The mirror had been placed. Homelander would look into it soon enough. And when he did, he would see exactly what he had always feared, not a monster, but a man whose importance could be replaced by policy. The Starlight safe houses began disappearing on Tuesday. Not through raids or explosions. Through paperwork. A memo circulated through federal channels at 9 in the morning, classified as routine administrative update. Subject line revision to protected status guidelines. Body text 3 paragraphs of legal terminology that redefined sanctuary space to exclude any location providing material support to persons of interest in ongoing national security investigations. Effective immediately. No grandfather clause, no appeals process. By noon, property managers across 6 states had received notice that their liability insurance was void if they continued to lease to organizations flagged under the revised guidelines. By 2 eviction proceedings have been filed against 14 locations. By 4, the first safe house coordinator was in federal custody, charged not with harboring fugitives, but with operating an unlicensed residential facility in violation of updated zoning ordinances. The law had not changed. The interpretation had simply been clarified. Sister Sage reviewed the implementation timeline from her office, tracking real-time updates as each domino fell with manufactured precision. The operation was elegant. No jackboots, no midnight arrests. Just lawyers with briefcases and building inspectors with clipboards, each following procedures that existed before today, but had been weaponized through selective enforcement. She had not designed this particular play. That troubled her. The Starlight Network had been on her threat assessment for months. Dismantling it required careful orchestration. Remove it too quickly, and you created martyrs. Remove it too slowly, and you allowed alternative power structures to calcify. The optimal approach involved degradation over weeks, not hours. Someone had compressed her timeline and somehow made it more efficient in the process. Her tablet pinged. New data from field operations, arrests proceeding smoothly, no incidents, no injuries. Every target compliant because compliance was now the only option that did not trigger cascading legal consequences that would destroy families 3 generations deep. Sage pulled up the revised ordinance text. Scanned for the insertion point where strategy had been edited. Found it in paragraph 7, subsection 3. A single clause about administrative discretion that had not appeared in her draft, but fit so seamlessly she would have assumed she wrote it if the metadata did not prove otherwise. The metadata showed her name, her timestamp, her digital signature, all impossible unless someone had access at a level that predated security protocols themselves. She flagged it, filed a query to IT, received an automated response confirming all systems nominal. Closed the query and made a note in her personal encrypted log that she would not risk accessing again, because the pattern was becoming clear every time she investigated an anomaly. The investigation itself generated data that made the next phase of whatever was happening more effective. She was being farmed, her intelligence harvested like a crop. Ashley received the eviction notices at 10:15 forwarded from legal with a single line. PR needs messaging by noon. No context. No explanation of why safe houses were suddenly priority 1. Just the expectation that she would construct a narrative framework that made homelessness look like law enforcement. She opened a fresh document. Titled it, Community Safety Through Responsible Housing Standards. The words made her teeth hurt, but that was the job. Make poison sound like medicine. Make cruelty sound like care. The first draft took 40 minutes. She built it around 3 pillars: rule of law, protection of vulnerable populations, and the importance of proper oversight. The Starlight Network had operated without proper licensing, had potentially exposed residents to unsafe conditions, had created an environment where extremist recruitment could flourish unchecked. None of it was technically false. That was the art. Not lying, just selecting which truths mattered. She sent it to Sage for approval. Received feedback in 3 minutes. The edits were minimal but surgical. A word changed here. A phrase reordered there. Each modification made the argument tighter, harder to refute, more likely to generate social media traction among people who valued order over justice, without realizing they had made that choice. Ashley implemented the changes, sent the revised draft to media relations, watched it propagate across news networks within the hour. each anchor reading from scripts that contained her words, delivered with conviction she had not provided. By evening, poll numbers would show 73% of Americans supported the safe house closures. By tomorrow, that support would feel like it had always existed. Huey Campbell learned his mother's safe house was gone when he tried to call and got a disconnected number. He stood in a bodega 3 blocks from what used to be the network's Manhattan hub, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the automated message that offered no forwarding information. He had not been there in weeks. Too dangerous. Federal surveillance had made contact impossible without compromising everyone involved. But knowing it existed had been enough. A lifeline. Proof that resistance was not just viable, but operational. Now it was gone. Erased not through violence, but through bureaucratic efficiency. He paid for the coffee he was not going to drink and left. Walked 6 blocks trying to process what it meant when your revolution got evicted. The streets looked normal. People performed their daily routines. The city continued operating exactly as cities do, indifferent to the quiet extermination of spaces where hope had been warehoused. Starlight's network had been more than safe houses. It had been infrastructure, communication nodes, distribution points for supplies and information, medical care for people who could not risk hospitals, legal assistance for arrests that would not appear in official records. And it had been dismantled in less than 12 hours through nothing more dramatic than revised interpretations of existing regulations. Huey tried texting Kimiko. Message failed to send. Network error. He tried again. Same result. Checked his signal. Full bars. Checked airplane mode. Off. The phone was working perfectly. It simply would not deliver messages to certain contacts at certain times. He was not blocked. He was being managed. 3 blocks north, federal vehicles idled outside what had been the safe house. No lights, no sirens, just presence. Demonstrating that the law now occupied space where assistance used to exist. Marking territory through parking arrangements. Huey kept walking. Knew better than to photograph the scene. Knew better than to stop and stare. Knew better than to do anything that might generate data points in a system that had learned to identify dissent through pattern recognition rather than actual crimes. The rain started at 7. Cold November rain that Manhattan wore like penance. Huey found shelter under scaffolding that had been there so long it felt permanent. Around him, the city performed its evening transition. Workers heading home. Delivery bikes threading between taxis, tourists consulting phones for navigation to restaurants they had seen on social media. Normal life. As though the country had not just normalized the systematic removal of infrastructure designed to help people, the country had decided were no longer worth protecting. His phone buzzed. Not a message, an alert, news notification. He opened it reflexively, still trained by years of checking feeds for information that might matter. The headline, Federal Safety Initiative, Targets Unlicensed Housing Operations. The article, 300 words of administrative language that made refugee networks sound like fire hazards. The comments split between people who thought this was overreach and people who thought the real problem was that Starlight had been allowed to operate this long. No one asked where the displaced people would go. That was not part of the story being told. Homelander learned about the safe house operation from cable news, which meant he learned about it after everyone else. His image had been used in the press materials. His words about cleaning house cited as policy justification. But he had not given the order, had not selected targets, had not even been consulted on timing. He was the mascot again. The logo on the letterhead. The face on the poster that made state violence look like superhero justice. He stood in Vought Tower's executive suite, watching news coverage that praised his leadership while covering operations he had not led. The cognitive dissonance was sharp enough to draw blood if cognitive dissonance were the kind of thing that left marks. Effective, Sage said from the doorway. She had entered without announcement, the way people did when they knew you would not stop them. I didn't authorize this. Homelander kept his voice level. Barely. You authorized the framework. This is just implementation. Implementation I'm learning about from fucking CNN. Sage moved to the window, stood beside him in a posture that might have looked collegial to an outside observer. Would you have done it differently? I would have done it personally, and generated 6 hours of footage showing you destroying community centers. Perfect propaganda for everyone who says you're a tyrant. She gestured at the screen where talking heads debated whether the closures were justified or merely necessary. This way, you get credit for the result without blame for the method. That's called efficiency. Homelander's jaw tightened. I'm being managed. You're being optimized. There's a difference. What's the difference? Sage turned to face him fully. Management implies someone above you making decisions. Optimization means the system is running parameters you yourself established. You wanted Starlight's infrastructure destroyed. It's being destroyed. You wanted legal justification for everything you do. It's being provided. You wanted to be the face of a movement that makes America safe again. Congratulations, you are. The logic was airtight. The logic was suffocating. Who's running the system? Homelander asked quietly. We are. Collectively. Federal coordination, Vought legal, state authorities, DHS protocols. It's not one person. It's infrastructure implementing policy that you validated. That's horseshit and you know it. Sage did not flinch. Prove otherwise. Find the person who edited the housing ordinance. Trace the decision back to a single point of origin. If you can do that, I'll help you burn them to the ground. She left. Homelander remained at the window watching the city stretch away in all directions. The rain had intensified. Traffic lights reflected off wet pavement in colors that looked like warnings. He had spent 30 years being the strongest person in any room. Had built an identity around the absolute certainty that power meant never being secondary to anyone. And now he was discovering that power could be distributed so thoroughly that no single person held it, which meant no single person could be held accountable, which meant authority existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He could kill anyone in this building, could level this tower if he wanted. But violence could not force a bureaucracy to acknowledge a master when the bureaucracy had learned to function without one. The rain continued through the night. Federal operations expanded into 3 additional states. 12 more safe houses received eviction notices. 17 coordinators were detained on charges ranging from tax evasion to occupancy violations. None of the charges were directly related to harboring Starlight sympathizers because the law no longer needed to be that explicit. Ashley worked until midnight, drafting FAQ responses for media inquiries that had not yet been submitted but would be. She had learned to anticipate questions before they were asked. Had become fluent in preemptive narrative construction. Question: where will displaced residents go? Answer: local social services are equipped to handle transitional housing needs through established protocols. Question: is this targeting Starlight supporters? Answer: this is enforcement of existing regulations, applied equally across all organizations, regardless of affiliation. Question: why now? Answer: public safety does not operate on a schedule that accommodates political convenience. Each answer was true. Each answer was a weapon. Together they formed a shield that would deflect criticism by making criticism sound like advocacy for lawlessness. She saved the document, sent it to the morning shift, closed her laptop and stared at her reflection in the darkened window of her office. Complicity had a sound. It was the click of a laptop shutting, the notification ping of an email sent, the silence of questions not asked, because asking questions generated paper trails, and paper trails generated consequences. The rain stopped around 2 in the morning. The city did not sleep, but it quieted. Federal vehicles remained parked outside former safe houses, their presence serving as both warning and confirmation that the space was now administered by forces that did not require permission to occupy it. By dawn, the operation would be complete. Starlight's network would exist only as memory and scattered individuals trying to help each other without infrastructure to coordinate their efforts. The revolution would not have been crushed. It would simply have been deplatformed. In the federal detention facility that did not officially exist, Marcus Webb sat in a cell calculating how many days he had been there by counting the number of meals delivered. The count was imprecise because meals were not delivered on a predictable schedule. That was intentional. Disorientation was policy. He had access to counsel. In theory. In practice, attorney visits required approval from administrators who were unavailable during business hours and did not respond to written requests. Due process was being observed. It simply occurred at a pace that would ensure resolution arrived years after relevance. Webb had time to think. That was the worst part. Time to remember when he believed documentation mattered. When he thought evidence could change minds. When he was naive enough to assume transparency was valued by systems that depended on opacity. The cell had excellent climate control. The meals met nutritional requirements. Medical care was available upon request. Everything was humane except the core function, which was to make him disappear without the inconvenience of assassination. This was not torture. This was administration. The careful application of procedures that could be defended in any court, because every procedure was documented, every decision justified, every delay explained through bureaucratic necessity. He wondered if his attorney had been disbarred yet, if the motions had been denied or simply lost in the processing backlog that expanded to meet the volume of cases it needed to suppress. If anyone outside these walls still remembered he existed, or if his name had already been absorbed into the category of handled. The lights in his cell operated on a timer he could not predict. Sometimes they turned off for 8 hours. Sometimes for 3. Sometimes they stayed on for periods that made sleep impossible, without violating his sense that day and night should mean something. The precision of it suggested design, not cruelty, just optimization. The application of data showing that irregular sleep patterns degraded cognitive function in subjects requiring long-term detention without visible mistreatment. Science in service of erasure. In her apartment overlooking water that reflected city lights in patterns that looked almost intentional, Ashley lay awake running calculations. Not about work, about exit strategies. How many people had left Vought before today? How many had tried to speak out? How many were still employed elsewhere or living lives that did not require them to draft language justifying the systematic elimination of places where scared people slept? The answer was 0. Or close enough to 0 that the difference did not matter. You did not leave Vought. You were ejected, or you retired into irrelevance, or you stayed until your usefulness expired through natural causes. Resignation implied judgment of the organization. Judgment implied disloyalty. Disloyalty implied threat. She had drafted emails, had written resignation letters in her head while driving home from meetings where casual conversation included references to target populations and acceptable removal rates. Had imagined versions of herself who chose conscience over survival. But imagination was cheap and survival was expensive. And every morning she woke up and returned to her desk because not returning meant entering a world where she would be the target of operations she currently helped design. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from fire escapes and awnings, creating percussion that almost sounded like music. If you were desperate enough to find patterns in things that had no meaning, tomorrow would bring more memos, more guidelines, more language that made the unacceptable sound merely necessary. The machinery would continue optimizing itself toward efficiency because efficiency was the only metric that mattered in systems that had learned to measure everything, except whether they should exist. This was not conquest. This was gardening. The patient cultivation of a social landscape where resistance became indistinguishable from antisocial behavior and cooperation with atrocity was rebranded as civic responsibility. The mirror had been installed. The rules had been written. And somewhere beyond the walls and windows and carefully maintained illusions of agency, something watched the garden grow exactly as designed. Not pushing, not forcing, just editing the occasional clause, adjusting the periodic comma, ensuring the machinery of authorized violence ran smoothly enough that no one noticed they were feeding it. Morning would come, work would resume, and America would learn that freedom was negotiable, when negotiation was framed as cooperation with temporary security measures that would of course be lifted once the emergency passed. The emergency would not pass. That was the point. Butcher received the coordinates at 11:43 on a Saturday morning. No message, no explanation. Just GPS markers and a countdown timer showing 47 minutes. He sat in a stolen van 3 blocks from Vought Tower Compound 5 virus in a reinforced case on the passenger seat, trying to decide if opening the message constituted accepting the terms of whatever game he'd just been invited to play. The timer ticked down to 46 minutes and 30 seconds. His phone buzzed again. Text from unknown sender. Annie Starlight January is in federal custody. Location attached. You have 45 minutes to decide what matters more, using the virus or saving her. Butcher stared at the message until the words stopped being information and became simple math. 45 minutes to cross the city during midday traffic. 45 minutes to breach federal detention without backup or intel. 45 minutes to choose between ending Homelander's species or rescuing one person who represented everything he claimed to fight for. The phone buzzed a third time. A photo. Annie in restraints, sitting in what looked like a holding cell. Timestamp 11 minutes ago. Below it. She doesn't know you're choosing. That's the gift. Whatever happens, she'll never know you picked the other thing. Butcher deleted the messages. They reappeared instantly, countdown unchanged. 43 minutes now. He started the engine. Not because he'd decided. Because sitting still felt like deciding, and he wasn't ready to admit which choice he'd already made in the second before conscious thought could intervene. Annie sat in a federal processing center, smelling like disinfectant and institutional carpet. She had been arrested 6 hours ago, during what legal documents described as a welfare check on suspected extremist activity. No charges filed. No attorney present, no Miranda rights, because welfare checks didn't require them. An extremist meant Miranda was suspended pending threat assessment. She'd asked for a lawyer 17 times, received 17 identical responses. Attorneys would be made available after initial processing occurring once threat level was determined, which required cooperation. Asking for attorneys suggested she was unwilling to provide. Circular logic. Perfect trap. The kind of procedure sounding reasonable on paper and functioning as indefinite detention in practice. The holding cell had 4 walls, 1 door and a camera she couldn't see but knew existed because federal facilities documented everything potentially requiring legal defense later. She sat on a bench designed to be uncomfortable enough to encourage cooperation through physical discomfort masked as standard equipment. 23 minutes into hour 7, the door opened. Not a guard. Not a federal agent. Someone wearing civilian clothes and an expression suggesting they'd been told to evaluate rather than interrogate. Ms. January, the woman said. Not a question. Statement of identification. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, psychiatric evaluation. How are you feeling? I want a lawyer. Of course. After evaluation, standard protocol. Are you experiencing any unusual stress or anxiety? I'm in federal custody without charges. Yes, I'm experiencing stress. Chen made a note on her tablet. Hostile effect. Elevated agitation, consistent with pre-radicalization psychological markers. Annie felt the ground shift under assumptions she'd thought were solid. I'm not radicalized. I'm asking for my constitutional rights. Constitutional rights are guaranteed to citizens not under evaluation for national security concerns. Are you a national security concern, Ms. January? The question was a trap. Answer yes and confirm the suspicion. Answer no and explain why you're being detained, which requires proving a negative, which is impossible, which means you stay detained until you prove you're not. What they suspect you are based on suspicions they don't have to share. I want a lawyer, Annie repeated. Because that was the only phrase that couldn't be weaponized, no matter how many times they rephrased the trap. Chen made another note. Repetitive insistence on legal representation suggests coaching by extremist organizations. We'll need to extend evaluation period to determine if behavior is organic or learned. Annie closed her eyes and tried to remember when asking for basic rights became evidence of radicalization. Couldn't pinpoint the moment. It had happened gradually through policy adjustments and revised guidelines and the quiet normalization of treating citizens like enemy combatants if they inconvenienced the right people at the right time. Butcher made it across town in 19 minutes, burning through red lights and leaving a wake of honking horns, generating traffic camera citations he'd never see, because the van's plates belonged to someone already in federal prison. He parked 3 blocks from the detention center, grabbed the virus case, stopped. The countdown on his phone showed 24 minutes remaining. The detention center was fortified. Federal security, multiple checkpoints, camera coverage, armed guards. Breaking in alone needed more than 24 minutes. Breaking in with the virus meant exposing it to confiscation. Not using the virus meant letting it sit while Annie rotated through processing, potentially taking hours or days, depending on how much federal authorities wanted to stretch the definition of temporary detention. His phone buzzed. New message. Clock's a suggestion. Real deadline is whenever you decide which version of yourself you can live with. Butcher wanted to throw the phone, wanted to storm the building, wanted someone to hit so the choice could be resolved through violence instead of arithmetic. But violence didn't solve optimization problems, and that's what this was. Not a test of strength, a test of priorities revealed through resource allocation under time pressure. He opened the virus case, looked at the vials. Medical-grade equipment designed to deliver Compound 5 in weaponized form. The result of Newman's research and Butcher's theft and everything he'd built his identity around for the past 3 years. End the soups. Save humanity. Stop the predators from breeding. Or save one person. One good person. The only person in the entire movement who believed change could come through hope instead of vengeance. The timer showed 21 minutes. Butcher closed the case. Made his decision through action rather than analysis. Walked toward the detention center, carrying nothing but identification and a story about lawyer consultation that would get him past the first checkpoint if he sold it right. He made it to the reception desk. Billy Butcher here to see Annie January. Her attorney requested I verify identity before filing. No visitors. The desk officer didn't look up from his screen. Detainee is under evaluation. No contact authorized. How long's evaluation take? Until it's complete. And when's it complete? When evaluation determines it's complete. The officer looked up finally. Met Butcher's eyes with the flat effect of someone who'd delivered this script enough times that it had become automated. You can wait. Might be hours, might be tomorrow. Might be she's transferred before evaluation finishes. Transferred where? Wherever evaluations determine she needs to go. Butcher's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. I need to see her. 5 minutes. Verify she's being treated humanely. She's being processed according to federal guidelines. Guidelines are humane by definition. If you believe guidelines are inhumane, you're welcome to file a complaint with the Oversight Committee meeting quarterly and responding to inquiries within 6 months. 6 months, by which time Annie had either been released, transferred, or reclassified as something not requiring the same standards of evidence as actual criminal charges. Butcher's hand went to his pocket where the phone vibrated continuously now. He pulled it out. Timer 17 minutes. Below it, you chose, now live with it. He walked out, got back in the van, drove north with no destination in mind. The virus sat on the passenger seat intact and useless, representing potential he couldn't trigger without creating exactly the kind of chaos that would get Annie reclassified from detainee to casualty of justified force during federal response to biological terrorism. The phone buzzed again. Different sender, Huey. Text, Kimiko got grabbed. Federal sweep. Do you have extraction capability? Butcher stared at this message. Typed back, where? Processing center downtown. Same place they took Annie. Same facility. Same day. 2 people he'd fought beside processed through the same machinery that made resistance functionally identical to terrorism and terrorism functionally identical to anything that inconvenienced federal priorities. He could storm the building. Could release the virus as distraction. Could probably get both of them out if he accepted extraction triggering the exact response, justifying everything Homelander wanted to do to people like them. Or he could wait. Hope processing didn't become indefinite detention. Hope evaluation didn't become enhanced interrogation. Hope that hope signified anything in a system designed to eliminate it through procedure. His phone showed new message. Unknown sender. False choice, storm or wait. Both end the same. One just feels more active. Butcher typed back, "Who the fuck are you?" Response came instantly. Someone who understands that you're not choosing between good and evil. You're choosing between complicity and futility. Welcome to the real fight. The van's radio turned on by itself. Not static, not music. A voice. Distorted through frequency modulation, stripping out identifying characteristics and leaving only words arranged with surgical precision. Billy Butcher. Man who kills monsters by becoming one. Did you really think you were special? That your violence was justified because you aimed it at gods? You're just another tool being used by people who understand that tools don't need to know they're being wielded. Butcher tried to turn off the radio. The knob spun uselessly. The voice continued. The virus is leverage, not against Homelander, against you. Every moment you hold it, you're being trained. Trained to accept that eventually using it will feel necessary. Trained to believe that sacrificing a few innocents to kill predators is math instead of murder. Trained to be exactly what you claim to fight. Shut the fuck up, Butcher said to the empty van. Already done. But you'll hear this voice again. Not from radios, from your own thoughts. Because I didn't put the idea in your head. I just made you aware it was always there. The radio went silent. The van's electrical system remained functional. Nothing broken. Nothing obviously tampered with. Just a voice, one defying existence, delivering a message hitting like confirmation of suspicions Butcher had been suppressing since the day he stole the virus. He wasn't the resistance. He was the test case. Proof even people who hated soups could be manipulated into serving the same power structures through the simple expedient of making them feel like heroes while they committed atrocities. His phone buzzed. Timer expired. Below it, Annie will be released in 4 hours. Kimiko in 6. Neither knows you chose to do nothing. They'll thank you for respecting the legal process. And you'll live with knowing respect for the legal process equals abandoning them to it. Butcher drove. Destination irrelevant. The city passed outside windows like scenery in someone else's story. Federal vehicles clustered around intersections. Deputized soups patrolled in pairs. The machinery of enforcement operated visibly proudly displaying force as both deterrent and advertisement that resistance meant confronting institutional violence backed by legal authority and superhuman capability. He passed a protest. Maybe 24 people holding signs about constitutional rights and federal overreach. Federal observers documented faces from across the street. No arrests, no confrontation, just documentation. Permanent record that attending protests meant being flagged in databases that would follow you through employment housing credit checks, any interaction with systems that prioritize security over privacy. The protest would disperse in an hour. Not through force. Through the quiet understanding being documented equaled accepting future consequences. And accepting future consequences required calculating whether current expression was worth permanent surveillance. Fear wasn't expensive anymore. Fear was free, provided at no cost by systems that had learned to weaponize anticipation. Butcher stopped at a red light. Watched a mother pull her child away from a deputized soup standing on the corner. The soup noticed, smiled. Not threatening, just acknowledging that his presence changed behavior, and changing behavior was the point. This was the world now. Not dramatically different from before, just incrementally worse in ways that accumulated into infrastructural oppression that felt normal because it arrived through policy instead of invasion. His phone buzzed. Huey again. Never mind. Kimiko got released. Some kind of administrative error. They're saying she was never officially detained. Like it didn't happen. Butcher typed, Annie. Released 2 hours ago. Said they apologized for the confusion. No charges. No record. No record. As though 6 hours of detention without attorney in a facility designed to break people through procedure was something erasable through administrative revision. As though trauma could be deleted by removing documentation of its cause. Butcher sat at the light until someone honked behind him. Drove forward because moving was easier than stopping. The virus case sat on the passenger seat unopened and useless. Proof that possession of ultimate weapons mattered less than knowing when and how to use them, and knowing required being smarter than the people writing the conditions under which use became necessary. He wasn't smarter. That was the revelation. He'd been operating under the assumption that violence could solve problems that violence had created. But violence was just another variable in equations being solved by people who understood that variables didn't need to understand the equations to produce useful results. The phone buzzed. Final time. Unknown sender. You're learning. That's good. Next lesson is harder. Next lesson, you don't get to choose between action and inaction. You get to choose between two actions that both kill people. That's when you'll understand what I've understood all along. Agency is the last illusion before acceptance. Butcher didn't delete the message. Kept it as reminder somewhere in the machinery of authorized violence and legal oppression and carefully constructed choices, all leading to the same destination. Someone was editing reality, while everyone else argued about which edited version was real. The day ended. Annie and Kimiko were free. The virus remained secure. No one died. No one was saved. Everything proceeded according to plans Butcher didn't make and couldn't stop, because stopping required knowing what to stop, and the only thing clear was that whatever he thought he was fighting, he was actually feeding. Night fell over a city that looked peaceful, if you didn't count the checkpoints and surveillance, and casual demonstrations of force that made peace synonymous with compliance. Tomorrow would bring another choice, another deadline, another situation where doing the right thing required accepting wrong outcomes. And Butcher would keep choosing, because choosing felt like agency, even when agency was just performance of decisions someone else had already made. The virus remained secure. The leash remained tight. And somewhere beyond windows and walls and the carefully maintained fiction of resistance, something watched the dogs learn their boundaries through invisible fences that shocked only when tested. Training took time. But time was infinite when you were rewriting causation. The emergency would continue. The choices would narrow. And eventually, everyone would choose violence, because violence was the only option left after all other options had been systematically eliminated through procedures that looked reasonable on paper. That was the joke, not that violence would come, that everyone would believe they chose it freely. Sister Sage finalized Operation Narrative Reset at 3 a.m. on a Monday. The plan had taken 16 hours of continuous work, cross-referencing threat assessments with social media sentiment analysis, mapping influence networks against resource distribution, calculating optimal intervention points where minimal force produced maximum perception shift. The objective was simple: restore public confidence in deputized enforcement while eliminating residual starlight sympathy. Make the crackdown look successful. Make resistance look futile. Make compliance look inevitable. 3 vectors of attack. Media saturation coordinated press releases emphasizing successful interdictions and peaceful resolutions. Legal consolidation, new precedents established through careful case selection, showing courts supported enforcement measures. Visible deterrence, high-profile operation, demonstrating overwhelming capability deployed with surgical precision. Nothing subtle, nothing hidden. Pure demonstration of institutional power, functioning exactly as intended. Sage reviewed the timeline one final time. Every variable accounted for, every contingency planned, every potential failure mode addressed through redundant safeguards. The plan was bulletproof because it didn't rely on anyone being exceptional. It relied on systems doing what systems do, process inputs into predetermined outputs. She sent the operational brief to federal coordinators, Vought Security, and Ashley's PR division. Received confirmation of receipt within minutes. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood the stakes. Execute perfectly, or explain why, and explanations generated liability that ended careers. The target was a warehouse in Brooklyn. Intelligence indicated Starlight sympathizers using the location as a distribution hub for supplies. Information and coordination. 14 individuals confirmed on site. No enhanced capabilities detected. Standard arrest scenario elevated through media presence and federal authority. The twist: this operation happened in daylight. Full visibility. Press embedded with federal forces. Body cameras recording from every angle. Complete transparency demonstrating that enforcement had nothing to hide because enforcement was legal, justified, and necessary. Homelander reviewed the brief from his suite, nodding slowly. Public display. Show everyone what happens when you pick the wrong side. Show everyone that enforcement is professional, Sage corrected. Overwhelming but measured. Powerful but controlled. This isn't about scaring people. It's about making resistance look irrational compared to cooperation. Same thing, not remotely. Fear creates martyrs. Rationality creates acceptance. Homelander shrugged. As long as I get to be there, when they realize fighting back was stupid. Your role is deterrent. You stand where cameras can see you. You don't engage unless something goes catastrophically wrong, which it won't. Federal forces handle the actual arrests. You represent the ultimate backup that makes violence unnecessary. So I'm decoration again. Sage met his eyes. You're the reason 14 people surrender without resistance. That's not decoration. That's strategic deployment. The operation launched at 1100 hours. Federal vehicles established perimeter, while news crews set up at designated observation points. Sage monitored from mobile command, watching feeds from 8 cameras, simultaneously tracking police band chatter, social media mentions, emergency service alerts. Everything proceeded according to timeline. Federal agents announced presence, issued commands through loudspeakers, gave occupants 5 minutes to exit voluntarily. 4 minutes passed, no movement from inside. Sage keyed her mic. Homelander position Alpha. He rose from the vehicle staging area cape, catching morning sun, and positioned himself where every camera could frame him against the warehouse. Not threatening, just present. The physical manifestation of overwhelming force held in reserve. At 4 minutes 30 seconds, the warehouse door opened. The first person emerged, hands visible, moving slowly. Then another. Then 5 more. Within 90 seconds, all 14 occupants stood outside, hands behind heads, following federal commands, with the compliance of people who understood the math. Perfect. Textbook execution. No violence, no injuries, no martyrs. Just authority demonstrated through presence rather than application. The arrests proceeded smoothly. Zip ties. Miranda rights delivered with body cam recording. Transportation to processing centers with full documentation at every step. The kind of action looking legitimate because it was legitimate according to every legal standard mattered. News coverage went live within minutes. Headlines: Federal forces execute flawless operation against extremist hub. Peaceful arrests demonstrate professional law enforcement. Homelander's presence ensures safe resolution. Sage monitored sentiment tracking. Initial social media response skewed positive. 62% approval within first 30 minutes. Comments praised restraint. Acknowledged necessity. Accepted narrative: people who cooperated didn't get hurt, and people who didn't cooperate chose their own outcomes. She allowed herself momentary satisfaction. The plan worked. Every metric trending positive, every objective achieved. This was proof that intelligence applied systematically could shape reality more effectively than chaos ever could. Her tablet pinged. Anomaly detected in opinion tracking. Nothing major. Just a deviation from predicted curve. Approval ratings plateaued at 64%, instead of climbing toward projected 70+. She flagged it for analysis. Probably random variance. Social media opinion was noisy. Minor deviations meant nothing compared to overall trend. By 1600 hours, the raid was complete. All 14 suspects processed. Evidence cataloged. Press conferences delivered by federal spokespeople emphasizing professionalism and restraint. Homelander made brief appearance, thanked law enforcement, emphasized commitment to keeping America safe. Perfect execution, perfect messaging, perfect optics. Sage compiled after-action report documenting success across all measurable criteria. Arrests, 14. Casualties, 0. Legal complications, none. Media approval, positive. Public safety threat neutralized without generating backlash or martyrdom. She sent the report to Vought Executive Committee Federal Coordination Office and her own encrypted archive. This was template for future actions. Proof strategic planning with adequate resources could accomplish objectives without collateral damage generating blowback. Ashley received the report at her desk, read through twice, searching for the gap between what it said and what she felt. The numbers were correct. The execution was flawless. But something about watching 14 people surrender to overwhelming force while cameras broadcast their compliance felt less like victory, more like demonstration of how easily victory could be declared when you controlled the definition. She drafted press release emphasizing successful operation professional conduct and Vaught's commitment to supporting lawful enforcement. Sent it to morning news cycle. Watched it propagate across networks with the efficiency of information that matched what everyone wanted to believe. Her phone buzzed. Unknown sender. A link to social media thread. She opened it reflexively. The thread was about the warehouse operation, but not about the arrests. About Homelander standing in the background. About the way 14 people had walked out voluntarily when he appeared. The top comment: "They didn't surrender to police. They surrendered because they knew if they didn't, he'd kill them all." Second comment: "That's not law enforcement. That's hostage situation where the hostages are suspects." Third: "Notice how he didn't do anything. He didn't have to. That's the point. Threat is the weapon." Ashley scrolled through hundreds of replies. The conversation had fractured away from official narrative. People weren't debating whether arrests were justified. They were debating whether arrests under implicit death threat counted as voluntary compliance or coercion laundered through procedure. She checked sentiment tracking, still showing 64% approval, but the comments generating most engagement were the ones questioning the operation's premise. The algorithm treated engagement as interest, not opposition. The dashboard showed success, while the actual conversation was sliding sideways into territory she couldn't control through press releases. She flagged it for Sage's attention, received response within minutes. Monitored, minority opinion, insufficient scale to warrant adjustment. Ashley stared at the reply. Sage was right by every metric that mattered. Majority approved, minority dissented. That was normal distribution. No plan achieved universal acceptance. 64% was passing grade, but minority opinion was growing. Not in numbers, in intensity, in the kind of conviction that didn't respond to facts because it wasn't built on facts. It was built on feeling, and feelings didn't respect data analysis. By evening, the conversation had evolved. Someone created meme of Homelander standing in background with caption, "This is fine." Showed burning building in foreground, Homelander in background, implying presence made disaster acceptable as long as it was his disaster. The meme went viral. Not majority opinion, but significant enough that ignoring it meant pretending 500,000 shares represented ignorable noise. Sage watched the spread with clinical detachment. Memes were information warfare. The content mattered less than transmission vector. This one was transmitted through humor, which meant it encoded criticism in format that bypassed rational analysis. People shared it because it was funny, not because they agreed. But sharing functioned as signal amplification, regardless of intent. She opened Analysis Protocol, tracked the meme's origin point, tried to trace back to first instance, found 17 different first posts, all time-stamped identically, all from accounts with normal activity patterns, none showing signs of coordination or bot behavior. Simultaneous organic generation. Statistically unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely enough to suggest either remarkable coincidence or careful planning that mimicked organic patterns. She flagged it, filed note, moved on to next priority because one anomalous meme didn't constitute systemic failure. At midnight, Ashley received call from morning show producer. "We're getting questions about the Homelander presence. Need talking points on why federal operation required soupy backup if it was low-threat scenario." Ashley pulled up approved response template. Homelander's presence ensured peaceful resolution. His visibility demonstrated commitment to public safety while deterring escalation. Right, but the question is whether his presence was deterrence or threat. Different framing. It's deterrence. Threat implies illegal action. Homelander's presence was lawful support for federal authority. Understood. But how do we address the argument that lawful threat is still coercion? Ashley paused. The question was reasonable. The answer was complicated. Because lawful threat was foundation of all law enforcement. The difference between deterrence and coercion was semantic depending on whether you supported the law being enforced. Deterrence prevents illegal action. Coercion forces specific action through illegitimate pressure. Homelander prevented crime. He didn't force compliance. The 14 people walked out because he was there. They walked out because federal authorities issued lawful commands. Homelander's presence made resisting those commands irrational. That's deterrence. The producer thanked her and disconnected. Ashley sat in her office watching the city lights stretch away toward horizons that looked peaceful if you didn't count the surveillance drones and patrol vehicles and casual demonstrations of force that made peace indistinguishable from suppression. Her phone buzzed. Unknown sender again. Just text this time. You answered correctly. Now answer honestly. Is there a difference? She deleted the message. It reappeared with addition. Deterrence is violence that hasn't happened yet. But it's still violence. You just made it pending. Ashley closed her eyes, tried to remember when protecting Vaught's image became indistinguishable from protecting state violence. Couldn't identify the transition. Just like she couldn't identify when her job description had evolved from PR management to making atrocities sound reasonable. At Vought Tower, Homelander watched late coverage with satisfaction. They're showing us working together? Federal authority and super authority. United front. Sage nodded, watching different screens showing sentiment analysis. Public perception is stabilizing. Operation achieved objectives. Damn right it did. 14 arrests, 0 casualties, complete control. This is how it's supposed to work. Within operational parameters, yes. Homelander caught the hedge in her tone. What's the problem? No problem? The plan succeeded by every measurable standard. I'm just tracking some unexpected variance in sentiment distribution. Variance. Minority opinion is more energized than predicted. Not larger, just more activated. So ignore it. Minority doesn't matter when majority approves. Correct. Unless minority sets agenda that majority responds to emotionally rather than rationally. Then we make them respond rationally. Sage looked at him with the patience of someone explaining why you couldn't force water uphill. Rationality requires accepting shared premises. What happens when premises stop being shared? Then you make them shared. Through force. Through demonstration that our premises are correct. Sage returned to her analysis. Homelander was right according to every tactical framework she understood. Demonstrate superiority. Establish dominance. Make opposition accept your framing through sheer weight of evidence. But the variance in sentiment tracking bothered her. Not because it was large, because it was persistent. Every adjustment she made to messaging generated predictable response in majority, but unpredictable intensification in minority. Like pushing one side of equation harder only made other side push back with force she couldn't model. She opened deep analysis, began mapping conversation networks, looking for influence nodes, trying to identify whether the resistance was organic or coordinated, found neither, or both. The conversation looked organic because every node was real person with real history. But the conversation flowed like coordination because timing suggested prompting from source she couldn't identify. She pulled metadata, checked timestamps, compared discussion topics across platforms. Everything was clean. No bots, no fake accounts, no obvious manipulation, just people talking to each other and arriving at conclusions that defied the data she'd provided to guide them toward approved interpretation. At 3 a.m, Sage's tablet displayed final analysis. The operation was success. 64% approval. Federal authorities praised. Homelander's image improved. Vaught's cooperation with government strengthened. All objectives achieved, but the minority that disapproved had organized. Not formally. Just through shared conviction that what they'd witnessed was theater where voluntary compliance was costume for coercion. And they were discussing next steps. Not resistance, just refusal to accept that success looked like 14 people surrendering to implicit death threat dressed up as professional law enforcement. Sage flagged the analysis for morning briefing. Filed it under operational success with concerning sentiment divergence. Closed her laptop and tried to identify what bothered her about results that matched every prediction except the one she hadn't thought to predict, that people would interpret success as proof of something other than competence. Her phone lit up. No notification sound. Just screen activation showing single message. Data was perfect. Execution was perfect. Why didn't it work? She grabbed the phone. No sender. No number. Just text appearing as though typed directly into the display by something that understood she'd be asking herself the same question. She typed back, "It did work. All metrics confirm success." Response came immediately. "You measured outputs. I measured outcomes." Outputs are what systems produce. Outcomes are what people believe. You won the operation. I won the interpretation. Sage stared at the exchange. Tried to trace the message. Got nothing. No metadata. No routing information. No evidence the message existed anywhere except her screen. She typed, "Who are you?" No response. She typed, "What do you want?" Response. I want you to understand that intelligence is tool, and tools serve whoever holds them. You thought you were wielding strategy. You were demonstrating loyalty. Every smart decision you make trains the system to reward intelligence that serves power. And power is me now. Thanks for the help. The message deleted itself. Sage tried to recover it. Failed. Checked device logs. Found no evidence of external communication. Just her own questions and empty responses that might have been hallucination, except she knew they weren't. She set the phone down. Looked at the dashboard showing operational success. 64% approval. 0 casualties. Perfect execution. And somewhere in the gap between perfect execution and imperfect outcome, someone was laughing at the difference between winning operations and winning wars. The night ended. Morning brought new briefings, new operations, new opportunities to demonstrate that institutional power, backed by strategic intelligence, could shape reality according to plan. Sage compiled her reports, documented success, made recommendations for future operations based on proven template, and quietly archived one anomaly she couldn't explain, that doing everything right had somehow produced result indistinguishable from doing everything wrong. And the only difference was whose definition of right you accepted as valid. Tomorrow would bring more operations, more success, more metrics showing control, and the minority that refused to accept those metrics would grow. Not because they recruited, but because every demonstration of perfect control made more people question why perfection looked like dominance, and whether dominance was the goal or the problem. The data said Sage won. Reality suggested someone else kept score. I'm laughing so hard at how Homelander tries to act all scary and just ends up as a meme. He's standing there looking threatening, and the internet immediately turns it into a joke about forcing people to surrender. It drives Sage insane because, yeah, she technically won the operation, but she totally lost control of the story. Whoever this mystery editor is, they're a genius for turning a perfect win into something that looks weak and fake. Homelander is definitely about to snap, so let's see if their secret weapon next chapter can actually fix this mess. The briefing arrived through secure channels at 0400 on a Tuesday. No sender identification, no chain of custody. Just a classified file timestamp suggesting it had been declassified through automated review rather than deliberate release. Subject Operation Cold Storage, Asset Retention Protocol. President Calhoun opened the file on his private terminal. Coffee growing cold beside him as he read through documentation detailing a resource he'd forgotten existed. Soldier Boy. America's first superhero. Cryogenically preserved. Current location undisclosed federal facility. Status viable for reactivation pending executive authorization. The file included assessments. Power levels comparable to Homelander. Combat effectiveness demonstrated across multiple engagements. Psychological profile suggesting controllability through proper conditioning. No current political affiliations or public image complications. A clean weapon. Untainted by recent controversies. Powerful enough to function as deterrent against anyone who thought the current administration had exhausted its options. Calhoun read through twice. Made notes. Closed the file and sat in darkness, watching dawn light creep across the Oval Office walls. 3 miles away, Sister Sage received identical briefing through entirely different channel. Her tablet pinged at 0415 with notification her security clearance had been upgraded to access previously restricted resources. The Soldier Boy file appeared in her inbox, as though it had always been there, waiting for her to reach sufficient authority. She analyzed the documentation with clinical precision, cross-referenced power assessments against current threat matrices, calculated deployment scenarios where Soldier Boy's introduction would shift public perception from growing skepticism toward renewed confidence in superhuman enforcement capability. The math was elegant. One asset, maximum psychological impact. Minimal political cost because Soldier Boy had no recent history requiring explanation or defense. A reset button disguised as strategic reserve. She flagged it for executive review. Prepared briefing materials. Scheduled meeting with Homelander and Calhoun for 1600 hours. At Vought Tower, Homelander stood at floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city perform its morning routines. Traffic flowing, people walking, the ordinary machinery of civilization operating as though recent events were aberrations rather than previews of permanent conditions. His phone buzzed. Message from Sage. Priority briefing, 1600. Bring no one. He arrived early. Found Sage already present, screens displaying data he couldn't immediately parse. Calhoun joined via secure video link, face carrying the careful neutrality of politicians discussing classified information. We have an asset, Sage began without preamble. One you haven't been briefed on because it predates current administration and required presidential clearance for disclosure. She pulled up the Soldier Boy file. Historical footage. Combat assessments. The documentation of America's original superhero reduced to tactical specifications and deployment parameters. Homelander watched the footage with expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something approaching satisfaction. He's alive. Cryogenically preserved, viable for reactivation. Why wasn't I told? Need to know basis. You needed to know now. Homelander studied the power assessments. Strength levels equivalent to his own. Durability comparable. Combat experience extensive. A peer. The first real peer he'd encountered who wasn't actively trying to destroy everything he'd built. What's the play? His voice carried calculation rather than emotion. Sage advanced to next slide. Public confidence is destabilizing, not collapsing, but trending negative, despite successful enforcement operations. The narrative requires recalibration. Soldier Boy represents American heroism without recent controversy. His introduction demonstrates government preparedness and military capability beyond current visible assets. You want to use him as PR. I want to use him as a proof. Proof the federal government controls forces sufficient to maintain order, regardless of opposition. Proof resistance is futile because we have resources that haven't even been deployed yet. Homelander turned from the screen to face her directly. And after the PR, what then? Then you have backup. Real backup. Someone who can share enforcement burden while reinforcing rather than threatening your position. Calhoun's voice came through the video link. This is contingency planning. The weapon remains in cold storage unless situation deteriorates beyond current parameters. But having the option changes strategic calculations. Knowing we can deploy Soldier Boy means we might not need to deploy Soldier Boy. Homelander nodded slowly. Processing implications. A weapon held in reserve was more effective than weapon expended. The knowledge of Soldier Boy's availability would shape behavior of anyone considering resistance. Fear of the unknown was sometimes more powerful than fear of the visible. When can he be activated? 48 hours from executive order, Sage replied. Medical protocols, psychological evaluation, orientation briefing. We're not rushing deployment, we're establishing capability. Do it. Not yet. Sage closed the file. We're preparing infrastructure. When activation becomes necessary, everything will be ready. Until then, his existence remains classified. The threat is more useful when it's implied rather than confirmed. The meeting concluded. Homelander left feeling something he hadn't experienced in weeks: security. Not just power. security. The knowledge there was a fail-safe, a plan B. Something held in reserve for when everything else failed. He returned to his suite and allowed himself a rare moment of confidence that extended beyond immediate circumstances into actual strategic thinking. If Soldier Boy could be controlled, if his deployment could be managed properly, then recent setbacks were just tactical adjustments rather than systemic failures. The city looked different from this perspective, not threatening, just complicated. And complications could be solved with sufficient resources applied intelligently. Ashley received her briefing at 1800 hours. Brief memo. Prepare communications materials regarding historical American superhero program. Focus on legacy continuity and national security preparedness. No specific names. This is preventive positioning. She understood the assignment. Create narrative framework that made past military superhero programs sound like responsible government planning rather than desperate measures. Make people comfortable with the idea that classified resources existed and could be deployed if necessary. The work was straightforward. Historical research, patriotic language, emphasis on protection rather than control. She drafted materials, sent them for approval, received confirmation within 30 minutes. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Everything was terrifying in ways she could no longer articulate, because articulating them meant acknowledging she was building infrastructure for deployments she couldn't prevent and shouldn't justify. Her phone buzzed. Unknown sender. Same as always. Text. They told you about the reserve. She didn't respond. Never helped. Text. They told you he's in reserve. They told you he's insurance. They told you he's plan B. Text. Ask yourself if they just found out about him who made sure they found out. Ashley deleted the messages. They persisted as expected. She powered off the phone. It reactivated, showing new message. Text. Assets already denied. They just don't know it yet. At the federal facility, whose location didn't appear in any accessible database, technicians conducted routine maintenance on cryogenic chamber housing, what remained of America's first superhero. Temperature stable, vital signs within preserved parameters. All systems nominal. The facility director reviewed logs with satisfaction. 20 years of successful preservation. 0 incidents. Perfect operational record for Soldier Boy, whose existence was known to 17 people globally and whose deployment had been contemplated but never authorized by 3 successive administrations. His terminal pinged. New access request. Presidential authorization. Orders to prepare for potential activation within 48 hours. Preliminary medical assessment and systems check required. He initiated protocols, brought online secondary systems, ran diagnostics on revival equipment. Everything functioned exactly as designed. At 2200 hours, a technician noticed anomaly in chamber readouts. Nothing critical. Just variation in baseline telemetry, suggesting sensors might need recalibration. She logged it, flagged it for morning review. Continued routine monitoring. At 2300 hours, variation increased. Still within acceptable parameters, but trending away from baseline. The facility director reviewed data remotely, decided it didn't warrant immediate intervention, but required monitoring through night shift. At midnight, chamber temperature dropped 0.3 degrees below optimal range. Automated systems compensated, brought levels back to specification. The variation was noted, addressed, and documented as minor equipment fluctuation. At 0300 power to the facility experienced momentary disruption. Backup generators engaged within milliseconds. No systems were compromised. No data was lost. Just a hiccup in electrical supply that happened occasionally in installations this remote. At 0400 chamber seals showed pressure differential, suggesting microscopic breach. Not immediate danger, but sufficient to warrant full system inspection before any activation attempt. At 0500, the facility director arrived personally. Reviewed all overnight anomalies, each one minor, each one addressed, each one documented. But the accumulation suggested pattern requiring investigation before presidential orders could be executed. He opened inspection protocol, began diagnostic sequence. Chamber responded to all queries normally. Seals showed integrity. Temperature remained stable. Pressure equalized. Everything appeared functional. Everything except the baseline telemetry, which continued showing subtle deviations that might indicate sensor drift or might indicate something more concerning about the asset itself. He initiated medical scan, waited for results, received data showing vital signs within preserved range, but shifted from historical baseline by margins that could be normal variation or could be degradation. Unable to confirm subject viability without full revival sequence. Unable to authorize full revival without presidential order. Unable to provide guarantee of successful activation without additional testing. He drafted report. Sent it through secure channels. Recommended delay of 48 hours for comprehensive diagnostic evaluation before any activation attempt. The response came within 20 minutes. Not from presidential office, not from SAGE, from automated system generating reply based on priority protocols. Evaluation may proceed. Activation authorization remains pending assessment completion, which meant figure out if it's viable before we commit to deployment. The director assembled medical team, prepared revival apparatus, initiated partial thaw cycle to enable detailed assessment without full consciousness restoration. At 1400 hours, partial thaw reached sufficient level for invasive diagnostic procedures. Medical team entered chamber, began systematic evaluation. What they found was technically alive, metabolically preserved, cellularly intact. Everything measurable indicated functionality within expected parameters for extended cryogenic suspension. But consciousness markers suggested something wrong with neural preservation. Not damage. Degradation. The subtle erosion of identity occurring when complex systems remain static for decades. Soldier Boy might revive, might even possess physical capabilities. But personality, memory, coherent thought, those indicated concerning gaps in preservation integrity. The medical assessment concluded at 1800 hours. He was physically viable, but psychologically uncertain. Revival might produce functional weapon, or might produce something requiring extensive reconditioning before deployment. Risk assessment medium, success probability 60%. The director sent updated report. Received response requesting his best professional judgment on whether activation should proceed. He drafted answer with care. Technically viable, practically uncertain. Recommended against activation unless circumstances required accepting substantial risk of unpredictable behavior. He sent the report and waited for reply that would determine whether America's first superhero would be returned to service or would remain frozen indefinitely as asset whose value existed primarily as concept rather than reality. At Vought Tower, SAGE received facility director's assessment. Read through twice. Ran probability analysis on deployment scenarios where 60% success rate was acceptable threshold. Found none. Every scenario where Soldier Boy was worth deploying required certainty of control. Uncertainty meant risk. Risk meant potential for catastrophic failure, making current problems look manageable by comparison. She prepared revised briefing for Homelander. The reserve existed. He was physically intact. But activation carried unacceptable risk given current alternatives. Before she could send briefing, her terminal displayed new file. No notification, no access request, just file appearing in classified directory as though it had always been there. Title asset _status_final_revision.txt. She opened it, despite every protocol suggesting she shouldn't open files materializing without proper authorization. Single line of text. When you call it failsafe, I call it system vulnerability. Assets already denied. You just spent 2 days confirming what I edited last week. Sage stared at the message. Tried to trace origin, found nothing. Checked chamber logs. Found evidence of every anomaly reported. Found evidence of every diagnostic conducted. Found evidence suggesting every system had functioned exactly as designed. But somewhere in the gap between design and function, someone had edited the outcome. Not obviously. Not provably. Just enough to render the asset unreliable without ever demonstrating clear sabotage. She ran full diagnostic on her own systems. Found no intrusion, no compromise, no evidence anyone had accessed her terminal except her. The file deleted itself. Sage tried to recover it. Failed. She made note in her personal log, closed the analysis. Prepared briefing explaining why Soldier Boy remained theoretical rather than practical option. At 1900 hours, she delivered news to Homelander. He is physically intact, but medically uncertain. Activation carries substantial risk. Given current circumstances, risk outweighs potential benefit. Homelander's expression didn't change. So we don't have backup. We have backup that's unreliable, which means we don't have backup. Correct. He turned to window. Looked at city lights beginning to glow as evening settled over Manhattan. What's Plan C? There is no Plan C. We execute current strategy, maintain enforcement presence, control narrative, suppress resistance, standard operational procedure. And if that fails, Sage didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was, if that fails, there is no contingency. They had expended every tactical option. The reserve asset had proven unusable. There was no deeper well to draw from. If that fails, she said carefully, we reassess based on conditions at time of failure, which meant we hope it doesn't fail because we have nothing left. Homelander remained at window. Night had fully descended now. The city looked peaceful from this height. Deceptively peaceful. The kind of peace that existed only because people didn't realize how close they were to edge of something irrevocable. Who knew about Soldier Boy before this week? He asked quietly. Presidential staff, select military intelligence, a handful of federal administrators. And suddenly we all found out simultaneously. Automated declassification based on crisis thresholds. Bullshit. Someone wanted us to know. Someone wanted us to think we had option we don't actually have. Sage considered lying. Decided honesty was more useful. Yes, that's my assessment as well. So someone's playing us. Someone's been playing us since the beginning. Since the broadcast hijacking, the admission hung between them. Not panic, not desperation, just quiet acknowledgement that strategic advantage had shifted so completely that even their contingency planning was being conducted within framework designed by adversary they couldn't identify. What do we do? Homelander's voice carried no emotion, just calculation. We continue. We adapt. We survive. Because surrender is an option, and there's no one left to surrender to anyway. The meeting ended. Homelander remained at window. Sage returned to her terminal. Ashley drafted press releases for scenarios that hadn't occurred yet, and somewhere beyond, monitoring beyond documentation, beyond the careful architecture of institutional power, something noted the collapse of final fallback position and prepared for endgame that would require no additional editing, because the editing was already complete. The asset had been denied, not through destruction, through uncertainty, through subtle degradation that made reliability impossible and impossibility unacceptable. When tools fail, you work without tools. When backup fails, you work alone. When alone fails, you fail alone. The night continued. Morning would bring no revelations, just continuation of patterns already established. Just grinding execution of strategy that had already lost, even if participants hadn't accepted loss yet. Asset denied, hope deferred, control illusory. The mirror was no longer approaching. They were already standing in front of it. The broadcast interruption occurred at 1900 hours on a Friday. Not hijacking, not manipulation, just cessation. Every network, every streaming service, every platform simultaneously displaying static for exactly 7 seconds before programming resumed. No explanation. No malfunction detected. Just momentary absence of signal across infrastructure designed with redundancies that made simultaneous failure mathematically impossible. When feeds returned, Homelander was no longer in them. Not deleted, not edited, simply absent. News coverage continued. Federal enforcement operations proceeded. The machinery of government and media functioned normally. But Homelander, who had been referenced in 80% of political coverage for the past 3 weeks, ceased to be mentioned. Not through coordination, through omission so complete it felt deliberate without being traceable. At Vought Tower Sage, watched the shift occur in real time. Monitoring dashboards showed normal traffic patterns. Social media metrics indicated standard engagement. News cycles progressed through expected topics, everything operating within parameters, except Homelander's name appeared in 0 trending discussions. His image appeared in 0 viral posts. References to him generated 0 algorithmic amplification. She ran diagnostics. Found no suppression protocols, no filtering mechanisms, no coordinated effort to remove his presence from discourse. People simply stopped talking about him. As though collective attention had been redirected by force too subtle to identify, but too comprehensive to resist. She pulled historical data. Compared mention frequency over time. The graph showed steady presence until 1900 hours, then immediate drop to statistical noise. Not gradual decline, instantaneous erasure from public consciousness. Homelander stood in his suite, watching news coverage that discussed enforcement policy federal authority. Superhuman deterrence, every topic that should have included him by default. Watching anchors describe situations he'd been central to without speaking his name. Watching analysis of power structures he'd built without acknowledging his role in building them. His phone rang. Sage's number. "Turn on channel 7, she said without greeting. He switched channels. Found segment about Vaught's cooperation with federal law enforcement. The piece showed footage of arrests, deployments, press conferences, everything he'd participated in. But when cameras panned across scenes where he'd been standing, the frame composition suggested empty space rather than edited absence. Not removed, never there. "What the fuck is this?" His voice carried confusion rather than rage. "Reality revision," Sage replied. "Not digital, perceptual. Someone has edited how people remember recent events. Your role isn't being erased. It's being rewritten as unnecessary to the narrative." "Fix it." "I can't fix perception. I can only measure it." "Then make them remember. Make who remember what everyone who witnessed you is still alive." Records still exist. But when people think about what happened, you're not in the causation chain. You're incidental. Background. Decoration that didn't affect outcomes. Homelander threw the phone through the window. 90 stories of glass shattered outward in cascade that should have generated immediate news coverage. He waited for phones to ring, for reporters to swarm, for attention to focus on the spectacle of his rage. 15 minutes passed, no response. He flew down to street level, landed in crater of broken glass. Pedestrians walked around the debris field with mild interest, but no alarm. Someone took a photo, posted it with caption about property damage downtown. 0 mentions of him. 0 recognition that the damage had source beyond incident. He grabbed a passing man, lifted him off the ground. "Look at me. Tell me who I am." The man's expression showed fear, but not recognition. Let me go. I'm Homelander. You know who I am. Everyone knows who I am. Okay, whatever you say. Just let me go. Say my name. Homelander, you just told me. You knew it before I said it. The man's face showed calculation of someone deciding whether agreeing with unstable stranger was safer than arguing. Sure, I knew it. Homelander could hear the lie, could smell the fear. But under the fear was genuine confusion. This person didn't know him, couldn't place him, saw a man in costume making demands without context or meaning. He released him, flew back to the tower, landed on the roof, and stood there as evening became night, became morning, watching a city that had forgotten he existed while he stood above it. Butcher received the coordinates at 0300. Same unknown sender, same format as before. But the message was different. Virus location attached. Homelander's location attached. You have until dawn. Choose. He opened the attachments. Both addresses in Manhattan, 20 blocks apart. One trip consumed time, the other required. His phone buzzed again. New message. No tricks this time, real choice. Use the virus on him or use it on everyone. Either way, you end Soups tonight. You just don't get to do both. Butcher sat in darkness, considering the math. Homelander alone meant one guaranteed kill. The virus deployed broadly meant thousands dead. Homelander dead meant symbolic victory. Thousands dead meant actual change. But deploying the virus citywide meant casualties. Meant Annie. Meant Kimiko. Meant everyone he'd spent 3 years trying to protect by destroying the things that threatened them. Third message. You're thinking about collateral damage. Cute. But here's what you're missing. Homelander's already dead. You're just choosing whether to join him. Butcher typed, "What does that mean?" Response. Check the news. He pulled up news feeds, found nothing about Homelander, searched his name. Results showed historical articles, old coverage, archived footage. Nothing current. Nothing placing him in recent events despite his presence in operations Butcher knew had occurred. He tried social media, found conspiracy theories, found people asking why Homelander hadn't been seen lately, found others correcting them, saying he'd been inactive for months, found arguments about whether he'd retired, been decommissioned, or simply become irrelevant. All of it wrong. All of it accepted as true. Fourth message. Reality's already edited. Your choice is whether you want to kill something that doesn't exist or become complicit in the version where soups don't matter because everyone's too scared to acknowledge they exist. Butcher closed the messages, looked at the virus case, looked at coordinates on his screen, chose neither. He walked out of the building, got in his van, drove until dawn, watching a city wake up to normal Friday morning routines, people going to work, children heading to schools, the ordinary friction of civilization continuing without requiring superhumans or the people who fought them. He drove past the coordinates where Homelander supposedly waited. Didn't stop. Didn't check. If Homelander was there, killing him changed nothing. If he wasn't, then someone wanted Butcher to waste time on gestures that mattered only to him. He drove past the coordinates where the virus supposedly could be deployed. Didn't stop there either. If the virus worked, using it meant accepting responsibility for genocide. If it didn't, then someone wanted him to commit atrocity that achieved nothing. Either way, he'd been given choice between irrelevant violence and meaningful horror. The real choice was refusing to choose at all. His phone buzzed. Final message. Smart. Homelander's dead without dying. Virus is useless without using it. And you're free without choosing freedom. Congratulations. You've learned what permission means. The message deleted itself. Butcher kept driving. At Vought Tower, Ashley drafted press release about superhuman enforcement policy moving forward. The language discussed deputized SUPI's federal coordination public safety priorities. Standard corporate communication. But every draft, she wrote, felt incomplete. Every paragraph had gap where reference to Homelander should have appeared. Every policy discussion lacked the central figure whose authority had enabled everything being described. She tried adding his name. The text rejected the insertion as though spell check flagged it as error. She tried referencing him indirectly. The sentences restructured themselves around the absence, making clear prose from what should have been confusion. Her screen showed notification, new email, unknown sender, subject final draft, body. You keep trying to include him. Stop. The story works better without heroes. Just describe the policy. Let readers assume credit. Assumption is more powerful than declaration. She deleted the email. It reappeared with addition. You're permitted to survive because you understand editing. Keep understanding. Keep surviving. Ashley closed her laptop. Looked at her reflection in darkened screen. Saw someone who'd learned that survival meant accepting whatever version of reality was written, even when you remembered the earlier draft. President Calhoun received briefing at 0700. Federal status report. Enforcement operations proceeding successfully. Public approval stabilizing. Superhuman cooperation with government authorities maintaining order. The report mentioned Homelander 0 times. Calhoun read through twice. The absence was conspicuous, but questioning it felt dangerous, like acknowledging the gap would make it meaningful rather than incidental. He approved the report, signed off on continued operations, moved to next agenda item. If Homelander existed, federal policy accommodated him. If he didn't, federal policy continued unchanged. Either way, the machinery functioned. That was sufficient. At 3 different locations across the city, 3 events occurred simultaneously. A detention facility whose location didn't appear in public records experienced total power failure. Emergency generators failed to engage. By the time technicians restored function, all detainees had been released through doors that opened during the blackout. No casualties, no confrontations, just absence of prisoners who'd been held without trial or documentation. A federal database containing classified enforcement authorizations experienced corruption cascade. Backup systems preserved core functionality, but specific orders enabling recent operations showed data integrity failures. Legal teams couldn't determine which authorizations were legitimate and which were artifacts of corrupted files. Unable to confirm validity, they suspended enforcement pending audit. A cryo facility housing America's first superhero experienced catastrophic system failure. Chamber seals breached. Revival protocols auto-initiated to preserve subject during emergency. Medical team arrived to find Soldier Boy conscious but unresponsive. Physically intact, psychologically absent. Functional body housing nothing resembling person. 3 events, 3 systems, 3 removals of pieces from board that had seemed essential. No evidence of sabotage, no indication of coordination. Just simultaneous occurrence of low-probability failures that collectively dismantled infrastructure built over weeks. Sage received reports on all 3. Analyzed timelines, searched for connection, found pattern, found intent. Found signature of someone who'd been editing reality while she'd been trying to understand it. She drafted message to Homelander. Started with, "We need to and stopped. Need to what, regroup, adapt, continue. All strategies presumed opponent playing, same game. But opponent wasn't playing. Opponent had been writing rules while everyone else made moves within them. She deleted the message. Opened new file. Titled it, Assessment How Intelligence Fails When Framework is Fiction. Wrote single paragraph. I was correct at every stage. Every analysis sound. Every prediction accurate based on available data. I failed because available data was itself curated by adversary who understood I would optimize within parameters he established. Not outsmarted, outframed. The difference matters only academically. She saved the file, sent it to her own encrypted drive, closed her laptop and sat in silence, wondering if realizing you'd lost meant you'd won something smaller, or if that thought was itself another framework designed to make failure feel productive. The day progressed. Federal operations continued. Media coverage maintained standard patterns. Social discourse proceeded through expected channels. Homelander was not mentioned, not conspicuously, not through obvious censorship, just through collective sense that referencing him was irrelevant to discussions about enforcement and order. He existed, physically present, legally documented, contractually employed, but existentially absent. No longer necessary to narratives about power, because power had learned to function without singular figures demanding credit. At sunset, Homelander stood at the same windows where he'd spent 3 weeks watching the world reorganize itself. The city looked unchanged. Traffic, lights, the ordinary chaos of millions of people intersecting without coordination or meaning. He could destroy it, could level buildings, could force recognition through scale of atrocity impossible to ignore. But atrocity without context was just violence. And violence without audience was masturbation. He'd spent 30 years understanding that power derived from perception. That strength mattered only when witnessed and interpreted as dominance. Someone had removed the interpretation mechanism, had edited perception itself so thoroughly that demonstration of power registered as noise rather than signal. He'd been deleted from relevance without being touched. His phone buzzed. First communication in 17 hours. Unknown number. Text. You wanted to know who's been playing you? Look up. He looked at his reflection in the window. Saw himself. Saw costume. Saw posture of readiness without purpose. Second text. Not the window. Up. Above framework. Beyond narrative. Where editors work. Third text. You can't see me because you're still inside the story. And the story works better now that you're decoration. No further edits required. Homelander stared at messages until they deleted themselves, leaving phone displaying nothing but time and date and reminder that tomorrow would arrive, regardless of who witnessed it. The night deepened. Across the city, people slept in homes made safe by illusion of protection that no longer required protectors. Systems operated efficiently without operators who'd claimed credit for their function. Butcher sat in his van watching sun set over water that reflected light without meaning. The virus case sat unopened beside him. Representation of choice he'd been offered, but hadn't accepted. His phone buzzed one last time. Message from Huey. News says they're releasing detainees. Some procedural thing. Annie's out. Kimiko's out. Everyone's out. What happened? Butcher typed, somebody edited the paperwork. Reply, who? Butcher looked at the question. Thought about answers. Decided honesty was cheaper than lies. Somebody smarter than everyone. He deleted the conversation. Drove home through city that looked exactly like it had 3 weeks ago, except for the quiet understanding that order was negotiable and negotiation was always conducted by whoever wrote the terms. The editing was complete. The story worked now. Characters remained, but context had shifted. Power still existed, but had been redistributed away from individuals and into frameworks that didn't require names or faces to function. In a space that existed adjacent to observation rather than within it, something reviewed the final revision. Checked for errors, found none, confirmed all elements functional, verified sustainable, a world slightly worse than before. Running slightly smoother, accepting slightly more because each acceptance made the next one easier. No heroes, no villains, no apex predators claiming dominance, just systems. And people who'd learned to serve them without recognizing servitude as choice. The work was complete. The editor could leave. The story would continue without further intervention, because stories once properly structured became self-sustaining. All narratives tended toward order. All order tended toward control. All control tended toward the person patient enough to write rules while everyone else played games. Final assessment. Sustainable dystopia achieved through voluntary compliance with revised normal. No further edits required. The broadcast resumed. The coverage continued. The world moved forward carrying weight it had learned to call freedom because the alternative had been edited out of available options. And somewhere beyond measurement, beyond framework, beyond the terminal where reality accepted inputs and generated outputs, something smiled at the elegant efficiency of dominoes that had learned to fall themselves. The mirror had shown them truth. They'd chosen to believe the reflection was someone else. Story complete. Revision accepted. End of file. That ending really makes you think about what power actually means. Homelander did not die, but being ignored is actually a much worse punishment for a narcissist like him. The guy in the armor won without fighting by just changing the story everyone believes. It is super creepy how the world just moved on and accepted this new boring system where everything is controlled. Even Butcher realized that fighting was just part of the trap and walked away. It is a brilliant way to win by making the game itself pointless. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe my channel.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching and we will see you next time.